The CEO laughed, the executives applauded, and someone even joked they should frame her employee badge as a souvenir. She never argued. She just smiled and walked out. By the next morning, the $42 million agreement was sitting unsigned on the investor's desk, and an emergency call to the board of directors had already begun. The executive boardroom looked almost too perfect to be real. Warm light spilled across the polished walnut table, the skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls, and crystal glasses caught the last orange glow of the setting sun. Everything in the room spoke of success, except the people. Their smiles were rehearsed, their compliments calculated, and every laugh seemed to carry an invisible price. At the far end of the table sat Victoria Hayes, quietly closing her notebook after 12 years of building one of the company's greatest success stories. She had negotiated impossible contracts, rescued failing partnerships, and spent countless nights solving problems no one else even knew existed. Yet as the meeting came to an end, none of those achievements appeared to matter. Richard Lawson, the CEO, stood with a champagne glass raised high. He loved an audience, and even more, he loved reminding everyone that he controlled the room. "Before we finish," he announced with a grin that spread faster than his words, "let's all give her a round of applause. It's Victoria's last day." Laughter exploded almost instantly. Some executives laughed because they genuinely found it amusing. Others laughed because the CEO was laughing. A few stared into their glasses, unwilling to join in but too cautious to object. The applause that followed sounded less like gratitude and more like the closing scene of a performance everyone had already decided to forget. Victoria didn't argue. She didn't defend herself or remind anyone how many victories had carried Richard's signature only because they had first passed through her hands. Instead, she smiled with remarkable calm, gathered her laptop, and thanked the assistant waiting near the door. Her composure unsettled more than one person in the room. Most employees who left after a public humiliation carried anger across their faces. She carried something else: quiet certainty. As the heavy boardroom door closed behind her, the laughter continued inside, but out in the silent hallway, it already felt distant, almost unimportant. One junior analyst watched her walk toward the elevator and couldn't shake the feeling that the wrong person had just left the company. The celebration resumed almost immediately. Champagne glasses touched, conversations drifted toward quarterly numbers, and Richard accepted compliments as though another brilliant decision had just strengthened his reputation. When someone briefly mentioned the final documents for the $42 million agreement scheduled to be reviewed by the lead investor the following morning, Richard dismissed the concern with a casual wave. "Legal will handle whatever's left," he said confidently before turning back to another joke. Nobody challenged him. Inside companies like this, confidence often sounded more convincing than competence, and people had learned that questioning the CEO rarely advanced a career. Outside, a gentle rain had begun washing the city streets, turning every traffic light into long ribbons of reflected color. Victoria stepped into the cool evening air, breathed deeply, and walked away without looking back at the tower where she had spent more than a decade of her life. Her phone buzzed once. A single message appeared on the screen. "You didn't deserve what happened in there." She read it, smiled sincerely for the first time that evening, and replied with only 3 words: "I'll be fine." There was no bitterness in her voice, no desire for revenge, only the quiet confidence of someone who understood that dignity could outlast applause. Several miles away, in a luxury hotel overlooking the river, advisors representing the company's lead investor were completing one final review before signing the $42 million agreement. One consultant paused over a section of the operational framework and frowned. "Who originally built this?" he asked. Another scanned the notes before answering. "Victoria Hayes." The room fell silent for only a second after someone quietly added, She left the company today. They moved on without another question, unaware that the name they had just spoken would become impossible to ignore much sooner than anyone expected. If the laughter in that boardroom felt satisfying tonight, it was only because no one there yet realized how expensive a single moment of arrogance could become. The next morning began with the kind of confidence that only comes after a night of celebration. Richard Lawson arrived at headquarters later than usual, still wearing the relaxed smile of a man convinced he had complete control over his company. The lobby buzzed with anticipation because the lead investor was scheduled to approve the long-awaited $42 million agreement before noon. Executives straightened their jackets, assistants hurried through the hallways carrying fresh folders, and members of the board of directors exchanged optimistic predictions about the announcement that would soon make headlines. No one mentioned Victoria Hayes. By the time the elevators filled with morning traffic, it was almost as if she had never worked there. Across the city, however, the atmosphere inside the investors' conference room was very different. The lead investor believed in one simple rule: never sign anything you haven't personally reviewed. He slowly turned each page of the agreement, occasionally making notes with a fountain pen that had accompanied him through decades of negotiations. Halfway through the operational transition section, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. He stopped reading, returned to an earlier page, then compared several supporting documents lying beside him. The room grew unusually quiet as his advisors exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, he looked up and asked a single question. "Who prepared this framework?" An advisor answered, "Victoria Hayes." Another quietly added, "She left the company yesterday." The investor closed the folder without signing it. "Call the board now." The phone rang inside headquarters only minutes later. The cheerful mood vanished almost instantly as directors hurried into the executive boardroom, where Richard had expected nothing more stressful than a ceremonial congratulations. Instead, the large screen displayed the lead investor waiting in silence. No greetings, no small talk. The agreement lay closed in front of him. "Before we move forward," he said calmly, "I'd like to understand why the person who designed the operational structure for this transaction is no longer with your company." Richard answered with practiced confidence, insisting the transition had been handled internally and everything remained under control. The investor listened without interrupting, but his expression revealed nothing. Then he asked for the documentation proving that every responsibility had been formally transferred and independently verified. Around the table, executives began opening laptops, searching folders, and exchanging increasingly nervous looks. For the first time in years, Richard realized he did not immediately have an answer. Outside the boardroom, rumors spread faster than official explanations. Employees who had laughed the previous evening now whispered in hallways, wondering why the board meeting had suddenly become closed to everyone. Even those who knew very little about the agreement sensed that something had shifted. Confidence had quietly given way to uncertainty, and the silence inside the executive floor felt heavier than any argument. Somewhere beyond those closed doors, one unanswered question continued hanging over the entire company, and every passing minute made it more difficult to pretend it didn't matter. Sometimes a company doesn't discover the value of its quietest employee until the moment everyone important starts asking the same name. What do you think the board is realizing right now? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for the next chapter of the story. The boardroom no longer resembled the place where laughter had echoed less than 24 hours earlier. The same polished table, the same panoramic windows, the same leather chairs were still there, but the confidence had disappeared. Richard Lawson tried to maintain control, speaking with the calm authority that had carried him through countless meetings, yet every answer he gave seemed to create two new questions. The lead investor listened patiently, before sliding a marked copy of the $42 million agreement across the table. Several sections had been highlighted in red. "These procedures aren't generic," he said evenly. "They're based on someone's operational experience. Whoever built this understood your company from the inside." No one spoke. One director finally admitted that most of the framework had been developed over several years, rather than during the negotiations themselves. "And who built it?" the investor asked again. This time, no one hesitated. "Victoria Hayes." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Richard cleared his throat and insisted the company had talented people capable of handling every transition. The investor nodded, but didn't appear convinced. "Talent isn't my concern," he replied. "Continuity is." He explained that investors rarely worried about products alone. They invested in systems, judgment, and the people who quietly prevented expensive mistakes before they ever appeared on a balance sheet. If the architect of those systems had left without a documented transition, the risk profile of the entire agreement had changed overnight. Several members of the board exchanged uneasy looks. They remembered meetings where Victoria had insisted on documenting every process, only to be told there would be time later. Later had finally arrived. Outside the boardroom, the atmosphere across headquarters had completely shifted. Conversations stopped whenever an executive walked by. The story of yesterday's farewell spread from office to office, growing more uncomfortable with every retelling. Employees who had laughed because everyone else laughed now found themselves avoiding eye contact. Daniel, the junior analyst, quietly opened archived project files and discovered Victoria's name attached to far more critical initiatives than anyone had realized. Her fingerprints were everywhere, not in bold headlines or executive announcements, but in the careful details that allowed everything else to function. The more he searched, the more one unsettling thought emerged. The company had celebrated the departure of the very person holding countless invisible pieces together. Richard remained determined to project certainty, but certainty had become increasingly difficult to perform. As another director entered the room carrying a stack of internal reports, the investor calmly folded his hands and said, "Before I sign anything, I need independent confirmation that your organization can operate at the same standard without the person who designed these systems." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even criticism. It was simply the kind of question experienced investors asked before committing millions of dollars. Yet no one around the table could answer it with complete confidence. And for the first time, Richard understood that reputations were built over years, but they could begin to crack in a single morning dot. Victoria Hayes had no idea what was happening inside the headquarters that morning, and she wasn't interested in finding out. Instead of refreshing the news or checking old company chats, she sat in a quiet neighborhood cafe where the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sound of light rain tapping against the windows. For the first time in years, her calendar was empty. It should have felt unsettling, yet it felt strangely peaceful. She opened a notebook filled with ideas she had never been allowed to pursue: simpler processes, stronger client relationships, and long-term strategies that had repeatedly been pushed aside in favor of flashy presentations. Looking through those pages, she realized something unexpected. She wasn't grieving the job. She was grieving the version of the company she had once believed in. Back at headquarters, the board of directors had moved from questions to damage control. Every department was asked to produce documentation proving that critical responsibilities had been transferred before Victoria's departure. Hours passed. Files appeared, spreadsheets were reviewed, and managers searched through years of emails, but an uncomfortable pattern kept emerging. Victoria had documented everything she was responsible for. What hadn't been documented were the countless decisions she made every day that never appeared in manuals because experience couldn't be copied into a checklist. She had noticed risks before they became crises, corrected numbers before they reached executives, and quietly connected teams that rarely communicated well with one another. None of those contributions had ever appeared in quarterly reports, yet everyone suddenly felt their absence. Richard watched the growing stack of incomplete reports with increasing frustration. Every answer seemed to expose another gap he never knew existed. Late that afternoon, the lead investor requested one final meeting before making a decision. The room fell silent as he placed the unsigned $42 million agreement in the center of the table. "This isn't about replacing one employee," he said calmly. "People leave companies every day. What concerns me is that your organization didn't seem to understand her value until after she walked out the door." No one argued. There was nothing left to argue. The investor continued, explaining that leadership wasn't measured by how confidently a CEO spoke during celebrations, but by whether talented people felt respected enough to stay. Around the table, several directors lowered their eyes. For the first time, the conversation was no longer about contracts or projections. It was about culture, judgment, and trust, things far more difficult to repair than a balance sheet. As evening settled over the city, the bright lights inside the executive floor remained on long after most employees had gone home. Yesterday, those same rooms had echoed with laughter. Tonight, every hallway felt unusually quiet, as though the building itself understood that one careless joke had revealed a problem much larger than anyone had been willing to admit. And somewhere beyond those walls, Victoria closed her notebook, stepped into the cool evening air, and walked forward without once looking back. By the end of the week, the atmosphere inside headquarters had become almost unrecognizable. The confident conversations that once filled every hallway had been replaced by quiet voices and closed office doors. No one celebrated anymore. Every department was answering urgent requests from the board of directors, while outside consultants reviewed months of internal decisions connected to the proposed $42 million agreement. What had started as a routine review after the lead investor's concerns quickly turned into something much larger. One missing report led to another. One overlooked decision exposed another weakness. The deeper they looked, the clearer the pattern became. Critical warnings had been ignored, experienced managers had been pushed aside, and several strategic recommendations, including many prepared by Victoria Hayes, had been dismissed without proper evaluation. The lead investor arrived for one final meeting with the board. He placed the unsigned agreement on the table and spoke with complete calm. "Our confidence in this company's leadership has changed." No one interrupted him. "The issue is no longer the agreement itself. The issue is governance." Those few words carried more weight than any raised voice could have. After several minutes of discussion, he closed the folder, stood up, and quietly announced that the $42 million agreement would not move forward. The room fell completely silent. Months of negotiations disappeared in a single sentence. When the conference room door closed behind him, everyone understood what had just happened. The company hadn't simply lost a contract, it had lost the trust that made the contract possible. An emergency meeting of the board of directors began less than an hour later. Independent auditors presented their findings one by one. Decisions had been approved without sufficient review. Internal concerns had been ignored. Experienced employees had repeatedly warned about operational risks, yet their recommendations had never reached the board. The investigation also confirmed that the public humiliation of Victoria Hayes had not been an isolated incident, but part of a leadership culture that discouraged disagreement and rewarded unquestioning loyalty. Every document painted the same picture. None of it could be blamed on a single employee. It pointed directly to years of poor executive judgment. Richard Lawson attempted to defend himself, insisting that every company experienced setbacks and that the failed agreement was only temporary. But the directors had already reached their conclusion. This was no longer about one lost investment. It was about the long list of mistakes that had finally come to light because someone had bothered to look closely. The chairman of the board thanked Richard for his years of service before announcing that his employment as chief executive officer was terminated, effective immediately. No applause followed, no speeches, only the quiet sound of papers being signed. Ironically, the same boardroom where Richard had mocked someone else's final day had now become the place where his own career at the company came to an end. Across town, Victoria knew nothing about the board's decision until late that evening when a former colleague called simply to check on her. She listened without celebrating, without smiling in triumph, and without saying a single unkind word about Richard. "I hope the company finds the leadership it deserves," she replied before ending the call. She closed her notebook, stepped outside into the fresh evening air, and looked toward a skyline glowing with new possibilities. She had walked away with her integrity intact, and in the end, that proved far more valuable than any title. The people who laughed had forgotten her position. The people who mattered remembered her character. The loudest voice in the room had lost everything it tried to protect, while the quietest person walked away with the one thing that could never be taken: respect.